What if a simple day at the mall turned into a life-changing event for an 8-year-old girl named Sarah? What started as an innocent shopping trip became a moment of humiliation and heartbreak when a mall cop, blinded by prejudice, crossed a line he could never take back. Little did he know, Sarah's father wasn't just any man. He was a judge, and this incident would unravel a chain of events that no one saw coming. Stay tuned for a story of justice, resilience, and the lesson of what happens when power is abused. The mall was bustling with holiday shoppers, the air filled with the faint scent of cinnamon pretzels and the soft hum of cheerful music. 8-year-old Sarah Keller wandered beside her nanny, clutching a small pink wallet adorned with glittery stars. It jingled with a few coins and neatly folded bills, savings from her allowance. Today, she was determined to buy her mother a birthday gift all by herself. Sarah's wide brown eyes sparkled with excitement as she stopped in front of a store filled with shiny trinkets. "Miss Fiona," she said, tugging at her nanny's hand. "Can I go look in there? I want to find something special for Mommy." Fiona smiled warmly. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll wait right here by the bench. Take your time." Nodding eagerly, Sarah stepped into the shop, her pink sneakers lighting up with every bounce of her step. She wandered between the glass cases, her small hands pressed against the displays as she admired the glittering necklaces and bracelets. One piece caught her eye, a delicate gold chain with a single pearl charm. It was perfect. Sarah reached into her wallet, counting her money carefully. She had just enough for the necklace. Beaming with pride, she made her way to the counter to ask the saleswoman for help, but as she turned, she accidentally brushed against a tall woman with sharp features and a fur coat draped around her shoulders. The woman's designer purse slipped from her arm, landing softly on the carpeted floor. She spun around, her eyes narrowing at Sarah like a hawk spotting its prey. "You little thief," the woman shrieked, snatching her bag from the ground. "You were trying to take my purse." Sarah froze, her face pale with shock. I didn't," she stammered, stepping back. "It was an accident, Don't lie to me," the woman snapped, her voice rising above the festive music. Shoppers turned to stare, their curious murmurs making the little girl's cheeks burn with embarrassment. From the edge of the crowd, a man in a mall cop uniform pushed his way through. Officer Brent, his heavy boots thudded against the floor as he approached, his thick arms crossed over his chest. "What's going on here?" he barked, his cold eyes locking onto Sarah. "This girl," the woman said, pointing an accusatory finger at Sarah, "tried to steal my purse. She was about to run off with it." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I wasn't. I just bumped into her. I didn't do anything." Officer Brent squatted down slightly to meet Sarah's height, but there was no kindness in his demeanor. "What's in the bag, kid?" he asked, nodding toward her small pink backpack. Sarah clutched the strap tightly, trembling. "Just my books and my wallet. I swear I didn't take anything." "Open it," he ordered, his voice sharp. Sarah's lips quivered, and she glanced toward the entrance of the store, hoping to see Fiona, but the crowd seemed to close in, and her nanny was nowhere in sight. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, Officer Brent grabbed her backpack roughly, yanking it off her shoulders. "Hey," she cried, reaching for it. "That's mine." Ignoring her protests, he unzipped the bag and dumped its contents onto the floor. A small storybook, a crumpled tissue, and her glittery pink wallet tumbled out. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Brent rummaged through her things. "There's nothing here," he muttered, clearly irritated. He shoved the items back into the bag and thrust it toward Sarah. "Next time, don't act suspicious, kid." The little girl's hands shook as she took the bag, but her fear turned to defiance. I wasn't acting suspicious," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "You didn't have to do that." Brent straightened, looming over her. "Watch your tone, little girl," he growled. "Don't talk back to me." Sarah took a step back, her small frame trembling, but her gaze steady. "You're mean," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. The officer's face twisted with anger. Without warning, his hand lashed out, striking her cheek. The sound of the slap echoed through the shop, silencing the whispers and gasps around them. Sarah staggered, her hand flying to her cheek. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stared up at the officer with a look that was far too mature for her young age. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice trembling with both hurt and determination. Brent scoffed, waving her off as if she were a nuisance. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, turning to the woman in the fur coat. "Let's get this over with." Clutching her backpack tightly, Sarah walked out of the store, her cheeks burning with humiliation and the sting of the slap. She found Fiona waiting anxiously by the bench, her face etched with worry. "What happened, sweetheart?" Fiona asked, kneeling to inspect Sarah's tear-streaked face. Sarah sniffled, her little fingers gripping her nanny's hand. "I just want to go home," she whispered, her voice trembling. As they left the mall, Sarah glanced back one last time, her heart heavy, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve began to grow. This isn't over. The Keller household was a serene and welcoming place, nestled in the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Its large windows overlooked a garden blooming with marigolds, a reflection of the family's warmth. Inside, the soft murmur of classical music played from a record player in the study, where Judge Robert Keller sat reviewing case files. His sharp mind and unwavering commitment to justice had earned him respect both in the courtroom and at home. That serenity shattered when the front door burst open, and Fiona, wide-eyed and breathless, rushed in with Sarah in tow. "Mr. Keller," Fiona called, her voice tinged with panic. Something terrible happened at the mall. Robert looked up sharply, his piercing gaze landing on his daughter. Sarah stood behind Fiona, her head bowed, clutching her backpack as if it were her only shield. But what truly made his heart drop was the angry red mark on her cheek, standing out against her dark brown skin. "Sarah," he said, rising from his desk, his voice calm but firm, "what happened?" Fiona knelt beside Sarah, coaxing her gently. "Sweetheart, tell your daddy." Sarah hesitated, her fingers gripping the straps of her bag. Her young mind struggled to piece together the right words. Finally, she looked up, tears glistening in her big brown eyes. "A man hit me," she whispered. Robert's chest tightened, and his voice dropped an octave. "Who?" "A mall cop," Fiona interjected quickly, her voice trembling with emotion. "He accused her of stealing and slapped her when she tried to explain." The air in the room grew heavy, the weight of Robert's silence filling the space. His face remained composed, but the storm brewing behind his eyes was unmistakable. "Fiona," he said evenly, though his tone carried the authority of a judge presiding over a high-stakes trial, "tell me everything." The nanny recounted the events in detail, from the accusations of the woman in the fur coat to Officer Brent's unwarranted aggression. Sarah added her quiet interjections, her voice shaking as she described the slap and the humiliation of having her belongings dumped on the floor. Robert listened intently, his expression unreadable, though his clenched fists betrayed his anger. When the story was finished, he knelt before Sarah, his hands resting gently on her small shoulders. "You did nothing wrong, Sarah," he said firmly, his voice softening for her. "Do you understand me? None of this was your fault." Sarah nodded, though tears spilled down her cheeks. "He didn't even let me explain, Daddy. He just hit me." Robert's jaw tightened. "No one has the right to treat you that way," he said, his tone steely. "Not ever." Robert stood, his mind already calculating his next steps. He turned to Fiona. "Did you see the officer's name tag?" "Yes, sir," Fiona replied without hesitation. "Brent, Officer Brent." Robert nodded, filing the name away. "And the store, did you see if there were cameras?" "There were," Fiona confirmed, "in the shop and the main hallways." A faint, grim smile touched Robert's lips. "Good," he said. "We'll need those." Sarah tugged at his sleeve, her voice small. "Are you going to make him say sorry, Daddy?" Robert crouched down again, his eyes level with hers. "Sweetheart, I'm going to make sure he understands that what he did was wrong, not just to you, but to anyone he's treated this way." "Will he get in trouble?" she asked, her innocence piercing through the weight of the moment. Robert hesitated for a beat, then replied, "Yes, Sarah, he will." Later that evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Robert sat in his study, his laptop open and phone pressed to his ear. He was meticulous in his research, gathering every detail he could about Officer Brent. He called in a favor from a colleague who had connections with the mall's management. The security footage was easy to obtain, given Robert's reputation, and it landed in his inbox within hours. As he reviewed the footage, his fists clenched at the sight of Brent towering over Sarah, his hand striking her small frame without hesitation. Robert leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was about standing against a systemic issue he had witnessed far too often in his courtroom: abuse of power, especially against those who were vulnerable. He drafted an official report, attaching the security footage and a formal letter of complaint to the police department. But Robert wasn't content to stop there. He reached out to the district attorney's office, ensuring the incident would be thoroughly investigated. The next morning, Robert sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, her favorite breakfast of chocolate chip pancakes in front of her. She picked at them absently, her usual bright demeanor subdued. "Are you okay, Sarah?" he asked gently. She looked up, her eyes searching his face. "Are you really going to help me, Daddy?" Robert smiled, reaching across the table to hold her small hand. "I'll always help you, Sarah. That's what fathers do." Sarah's lips curled into a small smile, for the first time since the incident. A flicker of hope returned to her eyes. As Robert watched her eat, his mind was resolute. Officer Brent had made a grave mistake, and soon he would learn exactly who he had slapped and the consequences of his actions. The morning air was crisp, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the courthouse, where Judge Robert Keller often delivered justice. Today, however, Robert wasn't sitting behind the bench. Instead, he walked with measured strides through the corridors of the city's police department, a man on a mission. In his hand, he carried a neatly bound folder. Inside were copies of the mall security footage, eyewitness statements Fiona had helped collect from other shoppers, and his formal complaint against Officer Brent. Every detail had been meticulously compiled, every fact unshakable. Robert's expression was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. He had spent the night strategizing, ensuring that the system designed to hold people accountable wouldn't fail his daughter. The receptionist at the police department guided Robert to a meeting room, where Captain Victor, a seasoned officer with graying hair and a stern expression, waited. "Judge Keller," Victor greeted, standing to shake Robert's hand. "What brings you here today?" Robert placed the folder on the table, his voice even but firm. "I'm here to discuss one of your officers, Captain." "Officer Brent." Victor's brows furrowed. "Brent? What about him?" Robert opened the folder and slid a printed frame from the footage across the table. It showed the moment Brent struck Sarah. Victor's face darkened as he looked at the image. "This happened 2 days ago at the Grandview Mall," Robert said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of anger. "That officer assaulted my 8-year-old daughter, Captain, without cause, without evidence, and with complete disregard for his authority's limits." Victor exhaled, his tone defensive. "Judge Keller, I'll need to review the context of this situation. Brent has been with us for years. He's a tough officer, but he's thorough." Robert's jaw tightened. Toughness is no excuse for abusing a child. The footage speaks for itself. There is no context that justifies this. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the DA's office, but I came to you first, out of respect, to give your department the chance to handle this internally." The weight of Robert's words hung in the air. Victor stared at the footage again, knowing the evidence was damning. "I'll need to speak to Brent," he said finally. "You do that," Robert replied, standing. "But understand this, if the department tries to sweep this under the rug, I will not hesitate to escalate. I expect accountability, Captain." Meanwhile, Officer Brent was at his desk in the precinct, reviewing minor incident reports from the mall. He was sipping coffee when Captain Victor's voice boomed through the room. "Brent, my office now." Brent's smug demeanor faltered as he set down his mug and made his way to the captain's office. Victor was waiting, the folder open on his desk. "What's this about, Captain?" Brent asked, trying to sound casual. "This," Victor said, turning the monitor to show the footage of Brent slapping Sarah. The color drained from Brent's face as he watched the clip, the damning evidence playing out in vivid detail. "That," Brent stammered, "that kid was being defiant. She looked suspicious." "She's 8 years old," Victor snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. "You humiliated her in public, dumped out her belongings, and struck her. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Brent tried to maintain his composure, but his confidence wavered. "I was just doing my job. These things happen." "No," Victor interrupted coldly. "What happened is a judge is coming after you, and he has every right to do so. You've put this entire department under scrutiny." By the afternoon, whispers of the incident spread through the precinct. Brent's colleagues, many of whom had tolerated his aggressive behavior in the past, now avoided his gaze. The weight of potential disciplinary action loomed over him, and he began to feel the walls closing in. Later that day, he received notice of an immediate suspension pending an investigation. His badge and firearm were confiscated, and he was escorted out of the precinct. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of his peers was a bitter pill to swallow. At home, Robert Keller sat with Sarah in the living room. She was curled up on the couch, a book in her lap, her cheek no longer red, but the emotional bruise still fresh in her eyes. "Sweetheart," Robert began, sitting beside her, "I spoke to the police today. The officer who hurt you has been suspended. They're investigating what happened." Sarah looked up at him, her voice small. "Will he go to jail?" Robert hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "That's up to the law to decide. But what's important is that he's being held accountable. No one should get away with treating people like that." Sarah nodded slowly. "Do you think he's sorry?" Robert smiled faintly. "Sometimes, people don't realize they've done wrong until they face the consequences. What matters is that you stood up for yourself, and I'll always stand up for you too." As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, Robert returned to his study, his mind still racing. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, but he knew this was only the beginning. Officer Brent would learn what it meant to wield power irresponsibly and how justice, when pursued with patience and precision, could deliver consequences he'd never forget. This fight wasn't just for Sarah. It was for every child who deserved to feel safe, every voice that deserved to be heard, and every injustice that demanded correction. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Officer Brent's modest apartment, but the warmth did little to comfort him. His badge, once a symbol of his authority, now sat in a drawer, confiscated and out of reach. The air was thick with the weight of his suspension, each minute stretching into an eternity as he awaited news from the department. Brent paced the small living room, his fists clenched. His mind replayed the slap over and over, the little girl's defiant words, "You'll regret this," echoing louder with each passing moment. It was just a kid, he thought bitterly. She should have kept quiet. But deep down, the truth gnawed at him. This wasn't going away. The knock at the door startled him. Brent opened it to find two officers in plain clothes, one of them holding a thick envelope. "Officer Brent," the taller one began, his tone formal. "What is this?" "This is your notice of formal charges. The district attorney's office is moving forward with an investigation into your conduct at the Grandview Mall." Brent's face twisted in frustration. "Are you serious?" Over one slap. The officer's expression remained neutral. "This isn't just about the slap. It's about abuse of power, use of excessive force, and potential racial bias. The footage is clear, Brent. You crossed a line." Brent snatched the envelope, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." The second officer added, "You'll need to appear for a disciplinary hearing next week. Your union representative has been informed. Until then, stay available." Meanwhile, Robert Keller's influence was already making waves beyond the police department. At the Grandview Mall, the management team had reviewed the incident and issued an apology to Robert, promising better oversight of their security staff. A memo went out to all tenants and employees at the mall, reminding them of their obligation to treat all patrons with respect, regardless of age, race, or background. Though it was a small step, Robert felt it was a necessary one. Change starts here, he thought. Back at the Keller household, Sarah was beginning to find her voice again. Her father had explained, in gentle terms, how the system worked, that Officer Brent was being held accountable for his actions, and that justice, though slow, would prevail. One evening, while Robert was working in his study, Sarah slipped in with a small stack of papers in her hands. "Daddy," she asked hesitantly. Robert looked up, his stern features softening. "Yes, sweetheart. I wrote something," she said, holding out the papers, "for school, about what happened." Robert took the pages and began to read. It was an essay written in her careful, childlike handwriting. Sarah described the day at the mall, the fear she felt, the humiliation, but also her hope that people could learn to be kinder. At the end, she wrote, "Sometimes, people hurt others because they don't understand them. I hope Officer Brent understands that it's not okay to be mean, even if you have a uniform." Robert felt a lump rise in his throat as he finished reading. "This is beautiful, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're so brave to write this." "Do you think he'll read it?" she asked. Robert smiled faintly. "Maybe one day he will." The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that wrapped itself around the tension like a coiled spring. Judge Robert Keller, seated at the plaintiff's table alongside his legal team, exuded an aura of quiet authority. He wasn't presiding over this case. He was a father seeking justice for his daughter. On the opposite side of the room sat Officer Brent, his face tight with a mix of defiance and unease. His attorney, a wiry man with slicked-back hair, whispered hurried advice into his ear. This wasn't just a disciplinary hearing. It had escalated into a full legal proceeding, with Robert leveraging every ounce of his influence to ensure the law took its proper course. The district attorney rose first, her voice firm yet controlled. Your Honor, today we address an egregious abuse of power by Officer Jacob Brent. This case isn't about a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. It's about a man entrusted with authority who used that power to assault an 8-year-old girl. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle over the room. We will show, through testimony and indisputable video evidence, that Officer Brent's actions were not only reckless but deeply harmful. Brent's attorney rose next, a calculated smile on his face. Your Honor, we acknowledge that the events at the Grandview Mall were unfortunate. However, we intend to demonstrate that Officer Brent acted within the scope of his duties, responding to a situation that, at the time, appeared suspicious. Robert's jaw tightened as the attorney continued. While hindsight may paint a different picture, we must remember that officers are tasked with making split-second decisions under pressure. Robert Keller was called to the stand. As he walked to the witness box, there was a palpable shift in the room. Here was a man accustomed to commanding respect, but today, he carried the weight of a father's pain. The district attorney began. Judge Keller, could you describe the impact this incident has had on your daughter, Sarah? Robert's voice was steady, but the emotion beneath it was unmistakable. Sarah is 8 years old. She is kind, curious, and full of life. But since that day, she's been quieter, more hesitant. She flinches when someone raises their voice. She doesn't feel safe, and that is a loss no child should endure. The attorney nodded. What was your reaction when you first learned of the incident? Robert's gaze shifted briefly to Brent, then back to the attorney. I was angry, not just as a father, but as someone who has spent his career upholding the law. The badge Officer Brent wore is supposed to represent justice and protection, not fear and harm. He failed my daughter, and he failed the trust placed in him by this community. Brent's attorney stood for cross-examination, his tone bordering on condescension. Judge Keller, with all due respect, you're a man of the law. Surely you understand that officers face difficult decisions in the moment. Robert's eyes were sharp. Difficult decisions do not excuse slapping a defenseless child or dumping her belongings onto the floor as if she were a criminal. That is not law enforcement. That is bullying. The attorney pressed on. Would you agree that Sarah's defiance, her refusal to comply immediately, could have been interpreted as suspicious? Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. Sarah is 8 years old. She was scared, not defiant. And even if she had been defiant, no interpretation justifies what Officer Brent did. Next, the district attorney introduced the key piece of evidence, the mall's security footage. The grainy video played on a large screen, showing the sequence of events in stark clarity. The courtroom watched as Sarah stood frozen under Officer Brent's towering presence, as her backpack was ripped away, and as the slap landed with brutal finality. Gasps rippled through the room, and even the judge's neutral expression hardened. Robert closed his eyes briefly, reliving the moment he had first seen the footage. When the video ended, the district attorney turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not law enforcement. This is unchecked power. This is abuse. Officer Brent took the stand next, his hands fidgeting as he adjusted the microphone. His attorney began with rehearsed questions, designed to paint him as a dedicated officer who made a mistake under pressure. Officer Brent, the attorney said, can you describe the events from your perspective? Brent cleared his throat. I saw a commotion. A woman accused the girl of attempting to steal her purse. I responded as I'm trained to do and asked the girl to show me her belongings. She refused, and her behavior seemed evasive. The attorney nodded sympathetically. And when you decided to take action, were you acting with malice? No, Brent replied quickly. I was just trying to do my job. The district attorney rose for cross-examination, her tone cutting. Officer Brent, were you aware that Sarah Keller is 8 years old? Yes, he admitted reluctantly. Do you believe an 8-year-old posed a threat serious enough to warrant physical force? Brent hesitated. No, but she was acting suspiciously. The district attorney pounced. Suspiciously? You mean she hesitated when a grown man with a badge demanded her belongings? She was scared, Officer Brent. Wouldn't you be if you were in her shoes? Brent stammered, unable to form a coherent response. As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their final arguments. The district attorney's voice was resolute. This case is about accountability. Officer Brent violated his duty to protect and serve, and in doing so, he caused harm to a child who deserved better. It is up to you, the jury, to hold him accountable. Brent's attorney made one last attempt to appeal to the jury's empathy. We all make mistakes. Officer Brent didn't act out of malice. He acted out of instinct. Let us not judge him too harshly for a single lapse. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the decision evident in their furrowed brows. As they returned to the courtroom, the foreperson stood, her voice clear and unwavering. We find the defendant, Officer Jacob Brent, guilty of misdemeanor assault and abuse of authority. A collective exhale filled the room. Robert felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. It was justice, but it couldn't erase the pain Sarah had endured. That evening, Robert returned home to Sarah, carrying the weight of the day's events, but also a sense of closure. "Daddy," Sarah asked, curling up beside him on the couch, "did the bad man get in trouble?" Robert wrapped an arm around her. "Yes, sweetheart, he did. Does that mean he won't hurt anyone else?" she whispered. Robert kissed the top of her head. "That's exactly what it means." For Sarah, the slap that once felt like an unshakable memory was beginning to fade, replaced by the warmth of her father's protection and the knowledge that justice, when pursued with determination, could make things right. The days following the disciplinary hearing were quieter at the Keller household, but the weight of the incident lingered in subtle ways. Sarah seemed more cautious when she left the house, clinging a little closer to her father or Fiona when they went out. Robert noticed the shift, and while he was relieved that justice had been served, he worried about the long-term impact on his daughter. One evening, as the family sat in the living room, Sarah picked at the corner of her drawing pad, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Robert asked, setting aside the legal brief he had been reviewing. Sarah hesitated, then looked up. "Do you think Officer Brent hates people like me?" The question hit Robert like a punch to the chest. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before answering. "No, Sarah," he said gently. "I don't think he hates you, but I do think he didn't see you for who you really are. Sometimes, people let their own fears or prejudices cloud their judgment. It's not fair, and it's not right, but that's why we stand up to them, so they can learn." Sarah tilted her head, her young mind working to process his words. But what if he doesn't learn? What if he just stays mean? Robert leaned forward, resting a hand on hers. "Some people might never change, Sarah, but what's important is that you never let their actions make you doubt yourself. You're strong, and you're kind, and no one can take that away from you." She nodded slowly, her small fingers curling around his. "I want to be strong, like you, Daddy." "You already are," he replied with a warm smile. "And you know what? Sometimes, being strong means speaking up, just like you did. I'm so proud of you for that." Later that week, Robert took Sarah to her favorite park, a sprawling green space with a playground, shaded trails, and a small pond where ducks often gathered. As Sarah ran ahead to the swings, Robert sat on a bench, lost in thought. The sight of Sarah laughing as she pumped her legs on the swing brought him some comfort. He realized that while the legal battle was over, the emotional scars of the incident would take longer to heal. Back at home that evening, Robert drafted a letter. It wasn't for the police department or the mall. It was addressed to Officer Brent. In it, he wrote not as a judge, but as a father. He described the impact of the incident on Sarah, emphasizing the lasting harm caused by Brent's actions. But Robert also offered something unexpected, an opportunity for Brent to reflect and grow. "Everyone makes mistakes," Robert wrote. "What defines us is how we learn from them. I hope you take this experience as a chance to understand the responsibility that comes with power and to treat others with the dignity and respect they deserve." He debated sending the letter, but ultimately, he felt it was the right thing to do. Justice had been served, but growth required a different kind of effort. He folded the letter and set it aside, deciding to mail it in the morning. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to regain her sense of security. With Robert's encouragement, she joined a local children's art class, where she made friends and immersed herself in creative projects. One day, she brought home a painting, a colorful depiction of a courtroom, with a little girl standing confidently beside her father. "This is you, Daddy," she explained, pointing to the tall figure in the black robe. "And this is me." Robert's heart swelled with pride as he studied the painting. "It's beautiful, Sarah, just like you." Though Officer Brent's career was over, the fallout from his actions continued to ripple through the community. The police department implemented new training programs, focused on de-escalation and implicit bias, initiatives that Robert quietly supported from behind the scenes. At the mall, security policies were revised, and more diverse hires were made to reflect the community they served. One day, as Robert and Sarah walked through the same mall where the incident had occurred, they passed the jewelry store. Sarah stopped, staring at the display case with wide eyes. "What is it, sweetheart?" Robert asked. "That's the necklace," she said softly, pointing to the delicate gold chain with the pearl charm, the one she had tried to buy for her mother that day. Robert smiled, kneeling beside her. "Would you like to get it now?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded, her smile returning. Together, they entered the store, and Sarah proudly handed over her pink wallet to pay. The saleswoman, recognizing her from the incident, offered a kind smile and wrapped the necklace carefully. As they left the store, Sarah held the little box tightly, her confidence shining brighter than the gold chain inside. "Do you think Mommy will like it?" she asked. "She'll love it," Robert replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, "because it came from you." That evening, as Sarah presented the necklace to her mother, Robert watched from the doorway, his heart full. The journey they had been on, one filled with pain, resilience, and growth, had brought them closer as a family. Justice wasn't just about consequences, he realized. It was about creating change, healing wounds, and ensuring that the next generation, represented by Sarah, would stand stronger in the face of adversity. Sarah's laughter echoed through the house, a reminder that despite the challenges, hope and love would always prevail.